Okay, welcome again, everyone. So this paper is with my colleague Arman Eshraghi from Cardiff Business School. We started this paper with Arman um, during really the first shock of the corona crisis. And I'll show you the video. Most probably, most of you remember this, but this paper started with a discussion of this video among the two of us. So I'm going to share the video.
I've just come out of the supermarket. There's no fruit and veg. I had a little cry in there. I'm a critical care nurse. I've just finished 48 hours of work. I just wanted to get some stuff in for the next 48 hours. There's no fruit, there's no vegetables. I just don't know how I'm supposed to stay healthy. And those people are just stripping the shelves of basic foods. You just need to stop it. Because it's people like me that are going to be looking after you when you're at your lowest. Just stop it, please.
That's very impressive. So at about the same time, I did personally see pictures like that. And I went to buy medicine and I couldn't find any painkillers in Boots. I went to buy food. I couldn't find any food in Tesco's. And this nurse had an impact, not only on us, but most probably most of you who have seen that. So she is making these comments following a 48-hour shift and appealing people stop panic buying. So that was the starting point for us to start thinking about making the sense of this corona crisis. So that was a starting point. And to us, it was important to understand the behavior of the agents under panic. So we have studied, and I have done consulting work with in 2 continents, basically, on bank runs. And here we were facing supermarket runs. And the economic agent behavior was very similar during the corona crisis and in supermarket runs to the consumer behavior during the bank runs in the 2008 crisis. Supermarket runs are unprecedented to our known history. We don't know another incidence. I mean, we know bank runs, but we don't know another incidence of supermarket runs. And it's an extreme level of collapsing of the networks. And the supply chain are very strong. There is no food shortage anywhere in the supply chain, yet these networks were at the brink of a collapse. So what we discussed initially was the collapse of the supply chains is very important because it puts vulnerable groups under more risk. So, I mean, think about a household, a low-income household. You may not have enough cash in your pocket, or you may not have a credit card with a limit to go buy in bulks and store at home. You might be elderly and you might be shopping on a day-to-day basis. You might be earning on a daily basis and you might be eating from hand to mouth. So these groups are all put at risk with the burden on the supply chains and the collapse of the supply chains. Now, what happened was panic in the face of fear of hunger. And that was mainly due to the fear of death. The virus is unknown. We don't know how long we will be staying at home, whether it's dangerous or how dangerous it is to leave home to get food, or you do it only once and then keep yourself fed for the next 3 months. We didn't know any one of those. So that was a stage of total uncertainty at that time. Now, we all had basic economics and finance training, and there what we have is a framework of basic economic utility, and we want to see how these agents account for their utility. So how do they cope with this sort of radical uncertainty? And there is Arman will go through more detail, but there is a sense of loss aversion that led to these panic runs and that led to impacts that are society-wide. So it's not only on one or two or individual economic agents, but there is an impact on the society at large. So we decided to focus on the catastrophic failure of the supermarket run, of the supermarket chains. So we first look at the mainstream models that we're trained with and how these mainstream models can create illusions of rationality. They're all based on the assumption of rationality, but do we observe it in real life or under panic circumstances? And if we do, how do we define this rationality? I mean, is it as we define in economic modeling? And how these models fail under panic and under greed. So we decided that we're going to develop a view of process orientation, and we decided to use Calon's theoretical framework, changing the unit of analysis from the economic agent as an atomic agent to the totality of the agent and the network as the unit. So that enables us to explain better what happened during the supermarket runs. And we compare the supermarket runs to bank runs, and we take it as an example, a very strong example of what is called in this theoretical framework overflowing externalities. Well, it is no longer a simple and a limited externality, but it becomes the core of the process. Now, I mean, there isn't much need to define the Homo economicus. I mean, most of us were trained in accounting, finance, economics, even history. We are familiar with the concept of this Homo economicus, which is some sort of a perfect person. And he is a rational economic man. And this rationality is defined in a very limited way, which is basically in economic modeling boils down to wealth maximization, has a utility function, which is of a certain shape, a logarithmic usually, utility function, and maximizes his wealth and makes perfectly rational decisions, meaning there is perfect foresight and can see the future outcome or mean from today. and someone who has unlimited processing power, information processing power. So is not limited, at least by time or other means such as money to process information, has access to all information and instantaneously. And they hold preferences that are in line with the standard expected utility theorem of von Neumann and Morgenstern. So that's a very limited understanding of human behavior in economic decision making. Now, if these are the assumptions and if they are representing human behavior, then obviously we shouldn't be seeing these supermarket runs, or in the past, we shouldn't be seeing the bank runs either, because these are self-damaging. So if you break the supply lines, I mean, there is enough for food for everyone, and the supermarket chains came together and made announcements that they will feed the nation and there is enough food for everyone. But I mean, you can't produce next year's rice today. You have to wait for time. So there is enough rice for today, and for tomorrow, there will be more rice that's coming out of the process. There is no problem in the food chain, but it's self-destructive if you want to buy rice for 3 months ahead, for 6 months ahead today, then you break the chains. And it's not very rational in that sense. So it's very difficult to see how this hoarding takes place under the assumptions of the standard utility theory. So, I mean, you could assume that, they would have some sort of a rational expectation about their future consumption and align their consumption accordingly. That didn't happen. So we are observing normal people. Meir Statman has a very fine new book, which he describes normal people. And these are the people we observe under normal circumstances. We observed them during the supermarket runs. We observed them during the bank runs in 2008. And normal people have emotions. They can panic. They can be afraid of death. They can be afraid of hunger. And they can panic. So these are very fundamental human emotions. And those emotions are at work, not only when they're watching TV and they watch a very emotional movie, but also in their economic decision making. So panic sets in, and when panic sets in, then the behavior can no longer be described as the rational economic behavior that we know of. So the commonality in both the bank runs in 2008 and supermarket runs in 2020 is that these systems are good. Just like the banking system, the supermarket system is also efficient. But if there is a panic run, the run itself can crash the system. So it's not like there is a problem with the system, but if there is a run, then the system crashes. So, most of the money supply is not in banknotes. It's virtual, M1, M2, etc. And it's in bank deposits. It's in the banking system. Same with the supermarket systems. Tomorrow's food will be produced tomorrow, not today. So in both cases, there was a run on crucial resources. And these runs can be triggered by rumors, can be triggered. There are various instances of bank runs based on rumors. Or in the case of Northern Rock, for example, information was not given to the agents on time. And there is a very strong impact from social visibility. When you see the picture that people are queuing in front of a bank, when you see the picture that the supermarket shelves are empty, then panic sets in. So, and in both cases, there is uncertainty. We don't know the virus in this case. We don't know how dangerous it is. We don't know how long it will take. We don't know whether we'll be allowed to leave home at all or how risky it is to go shopping into a supermarket. Enormous amount of uncertainty. So the second commonality of these events, both bank runs and supermarket runs, is the run itself is destabilizing. So it's the run itself that destabilizes the supply chains in food in the supermarket runs, and that destabilizes the financial system, and more than one bank had to be rescued while the run was just on one bank at one time. So in both instances, there is need for additional regulation, and the government had to step in to ensure the viability of these systems. Now, how do people deal with an unexpected danger? So in the face of uncertainty, how do you keep yourself away from danger? How do you cope with that sort of uncertainty? We rely basically in behavioral finance on the research in psychology, and we know that under various circumstances, through various tests, that people don't like uncertainty. And there is a difference between the fear of the unknown, which was the case during the corona crisis, and the fear of the known unknown, which is if you can quantify it with some sort of a probability distribution. So if you can say, okay, so 50-50, maybe there will be a food shortage, maybe there won't, that's one thing. But if you're under total uncertainty, you know nothing about what's going to happen tomorrow, that's another thing, and that's more fearsome. So in the face of risk, there is a luxury of choice. So you can do this, you can do that, but it's very difficult to react to total uncertainty when unprecedented events occur. So in these situations, the one place you look at would be the others. What are the others doing in this case? Are they fighting? Are they flying? Are they running? Are they staying intact? Do they continue with their former behavior? Do they change their behavior? So in the face of death, or in the face of any danger whatsoever, one reaction would be to fight, one reaction would be flight. And in a state of panic, it's almost natural that you follow the others in running away from the perceived danger. So we argue that these panic runs are collective flights. So people together show the behavior of flight, and they do it as a defense against the anxiety of uncertainty, and that gives them an illusion of control over the foreseeable future. So if you have enough food for 3 months, 6 months, etc., then you feel safe. Okay, so my family is not going to be hungry. But there are overflows for this. So I remember that there was a shortage of flour, there was a shortage of yeast, there was a shortage of all sorts of cleaning materials, basically. And we look at those, and we look at the development of the 2008 crisis basically together. And another commonality in the two crises was the international nature of it. So we've seen the same picture of empty supermarket shelves in almost every country. So in almost every television channel in other countries, in almost every newspaper in other countries, there was a picture of empty empty supermarket shelves. And also the toilet rolls, for example. I mean, at the beginning, it was only in the US, but we've seen the same toilet roll shortage almost across the world, everywhere in the world. So we argue that, obviously when the markets are working well, then self-interest can present an option that the system provides everyone what they want and provides the food that everyone wants. So some eat rice, some eat pasta, some eat potatoes, and the system is well equipped to supply that and keeps the people away from hunger. But the run behavior on supermarkets triggered food shortages. So the channel itself, the existing channel itself, the supermarket chains, they triggered food shortages and put enormous strains on the markets and the agents' operations on these networks. So we discuss the overflowing risk of hunger from the perspective of the supermarket runs, and the food shortages that they have generated, and in comparison to previous bank runs. And we are particularly cautious about these collapses that are systemic because of the impact they have on vulnerable groups of the society. So in both cases, and especially in the case of supermarket runs, it was very clear that the impact was mainly on low income and higher age groups. And they were put under additional risk due to the runs on the supermarkets. So the theoretical framework we will be using, we think captures this situation. And we use Collins' framework because we want to combine together the agent and the network. So we don't see it as these atomic agents working on their own. And as you can see in any picture of a network, that there are arrows that combine these agents, one or many, but the agent and the network are one and only. And this behavior can be explained through that sort of theoretical framework. So we don't separate the agents and the networks because the agent and the network is one and only, and people are not atomic. They think about it and they do it, but they see each other, they talk to each other, they read the newspaper, they watch the television, and that's how they act together. So Arman, I'm passing this to you now. So I'm stopping the screen sharing.
Thank you very much, Gulnur, for passing on the baton. I'll carry on from here. Right. So first of all, I similarly welcome all of you and thank you for tuning in this very, I'm sure, what is a very busy day of the year for all of us academics. So yes, I'll just continue the story and I think hopefully conclude by drawing parallels with other types of panic runs. So one of our core arguments is that first of all, you cannot explain this rationally. The models that try to focus narrowly on self-interest from a utilitarian point of view cannot explain what's going on because, well, from a psychological perspective, what's driving a lot of these behaviors is visceral fears. Gulnur mentioned fear of hunger, which is one of the key ones. And you cannot act in a rational state of mind when you're viscerally driven by these kinds of drives. But of course, that's the cognitive, that's the psychological layer. Apart from that, or going further, we need the social layer as well. And I think that's what we're doing in this paper. And in fact, that's what many other behavioral finance scholars are inching towards. So people are now talking about social finance. And so this is really trying to look at the big picture, including what we know about individual psychology, but adding the social layer. So we think that the narrow use of self-interest is not helpful. It's not destructive. It's self-destructive in a sense. Of course, we see the spread of fear of hunger as one of the key emotions here. And there have been things that have enabled the contagion or the spillover of fear. Well, for example, you see people coming up, pulling up to the car parks in huge supermarkets with big cars and big trunks and filling them up, and those images get portrayed in the media quite widely. And those images do not just report what goes on the ground, but they also shape people's behavior. And this is very important. So a major part of Callan's model is the argument that these frames have agency. So the frames do not just report, they're not like cameras, but they're like engines. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Professor Donald Mackenzie's well-known book on the sociology of finance called An Engine, Not a Camera. And his argument is that many of these financial models, such as Black-Scholes, do not just depict what goes on in a particular financial ecosystem, but they also shape it because of the assumptions which are built into these models. And what we argue is that the media and the way they portray the contagion of the fear enables the contagion of the fear. The images of the big cars, the availability of credits, which would then allow people to massively draw on their bank accounts to overstock, would obviously help. In cases, of course, houses that can store, garages and other storage spaces can help. So it is emotional, it is behavioral. The emotions are cognitive, but also some of them are quite unconscious as well. We all know that there's been a lot of anxiety about COVID, and how could we deal with that anxiety and then understand what goes on in these panic runs? So again, coming back to Callan, Callan talks about framing as calculating tool, and effectively, as you can see in this quote, he argues that frames do not merely record a reality independent of themselves, but they contribute powerfully to shaping it. Just by measuring it, they shape it. So frames have agency. And that's why the frames can overflow. So again, the frames could be the images that gets widely circulated in the media. It could be the accounts. It could be conversations between individuals. And so that's why, in order to understand these types of panic runs, we need to go beyond just individual psychology. We need to go beyond generation 1 behavioral finance and into generation 2 and 3. And that's exactly what drew our attention to Callan. So the frames overflow. The overflow can be multi-directional. So it overflows from vulnerable people to less vulnerable people, to the elderly population, to the population at risk, to the individuals who are on 0-hour contracts, to the people who want to probably go to the supermarket and overstock, but do not have the time or cannot afford to, or are physically unable to. And so you can see that the fear spreads in these implicit ways, nuanced ways. And the overflows have an ebb and flow structure themselves. So they travel back, as we saw with the second COVID wave. So the supermarket runs happened again in the second wave, although at a in a diminished way, but still we saw that. So these are, so 6 weeks into the UK lockdown, you may remember that 6 weeks, so a month and a half into it, still basic items such as flour, yeast, etc., were very difficult to find. That's really, really interesting. And we have in this country a supply chain system which is very resilient and very robust. So clearly the problem is not on the supply side, it is on the demand side. The overflows in the supermarkets runs, examples or sub-examples of that include, as mentioned, overflows to vulnerable groups, shortages of essential foods and basic items. We witnessed increases in households referring to food banks. We also noticed shortages of food donations, so donations that in normal times would have been at a certain steady state. They actually went down, presumably because people had less willingness on average to make these donations, or maybe less able to do that because of social distancing. Slightly higher food prices in general. So could we understand this from the perspective of finance just by looking at pure rational utilitarian self-interest? And what we argue is we cannot. So I noticed one of the questions in the Q&A as Gulnur was talking was about the well-known Diamond and Dybvig model published in Journal of Political Economy. And so that is a rational model, which of course has a lot of currency in mainstream finance. But we argue those rational models only go so far, and you do need the social layer. And of course, this is something we can pick up in the Q&A. So I talked about the agency of powerful images, and here you see one, which was very widely, I think this was taken in the US in a Walmart, and it was widely circulated around the world. But of course, in the UK, we saw many similar examples in the early days of the panic runs. But it's important or useful to remember that this was a global phenomenon. It was not just the UK or the US, it was around the world. For example, in Singapore, the issue became so drastic with regards to shortages of rice and instant noodles that their prime minister actually publicly gave assurances. That's really interesting. It's very extreme if you think about it, that the prime minister may come on TV and assure the public about the lack of a shortage. In New Zealand, for example, supermarket spending shot up 40%, which is a significant amount. In Malaysia, 800% increase in hand sanitizer sales. Of course, a certain increase is understandable, but 800% is just overstocking. So it was global. That's obviously, I think, easy to argue. Secondly, it's what we argue in our study is that it's not helpful to refer to these as just externalities. We may have come across this term in some circles, that these are just externalities or black swans, and the reality is it goes far beyond that. What we're seeing is individuals with complex psychological and social profiles interacting with each other in complex social networks, and the networks and the agents also constantly in a dynamic way affecting each other, and all of this against the backdrop of constant bombardment of new information, usually rather dark news from, especially in the early days, and people against the fears of people losing their health, but also losing their economic viability, their incomes, and so on. So there are very turbulent times, of course, and once again, I think you cannot just merely think about self-interest as the key formula to explain what goes on. So I mentioned black swans. Again, we saw this a lot in the press, but also in some academic circles, that people refer to COVID as a black swan. So this, we argue, is far from the truth. If you refer to Taleb's own definition of black swan, he argues it's an outlier which lies outside the realm of regular expectations, and it carries an extreme impact. And in spite of its outlier status, human nature makes us concoct explanations for its occurrence. Now, I think we would all agree that COVID fails the first test visibly, because we have had in the past instances of infectious diseases turning into epidemics and pandemics. Not to this extent in recent past, but we have had smaller examples of this, and we have had plenty of warnings. So it's not the textbook definition of a black swan. A gray swan maybe, but not a black swan. But the point is, I mean, going beyond just terminology, the point is summarizing what goes on with something as complex as the psychology of people's reactions to COVID into a rather crass term such as black swan does not help. And we really need to have a nuanced sociological explanation that goes beyond these sorts of terminologies. So they were not mere externalities. They were not accidental leaks in the supply chain, supermarket supply chain pipework, if you like. Bloomberg, so to give you an example of unhelpful media characterization, Bloomberg called what we saw in the early days as hamster buying. So when rodents stuff their chicks with nuts, it's a behavior commonly observed, apparently, among some rodents. But again, this kind of oversimplification ignores the complex reality, which is the relation between individuals and their networks and their visceral fears. So going back to Callan, we argue that overflows of this nature are helpful in explaining what goes on. Also, there are similarities in that sense between what we saw in the supermarkets landscape and, of course, what we know from bank runs. Of course, there are differences too, clearly, but the similarities are striking from a sociological point of, and from a behavioral point of view. So, of course, we all know Northern Rock, but the picture on the top left is another well-documented bank run in Hong Kong. So it happens everywhere. The rational models talk about shifts in expectations, and again, rational expectations. And when they talk about observed behavior, they may go as far as calling it apparently irrational, but never irrational. The behavioral / sociological models and that would look at panic would argue that these bank runs can happen even when the fundamentals are pretty strong. Spread of rumors obviously can have a self-fulfilling prophecy effect and lead on to bank runs. But more importantly, they can happen because of emotions such as fear. And again, they can have a spillover effect. But a more nuanced way of looking at it is how individuals react in these situations in relation to other individuals, in relation to what their family members do or what their neighbors do. And often we don't see that nuance captured in traditional mainstream models. So to conclude, I think it's obvious that pandemics such as COVID can induce significant psychological and sociological or social pressures on agents, but also on networks. And that's what is very key for us here. So we say, or we argue, in fact, we draw on sociologists such as Callan to argue that it is not helpful to focus on the atomized behavior of economic agents. Rather, we have to look at the relation agents have with their immediate networks. So that could be the family, that could be the community, the immediate surrounding community, or it could be a social network, a group of acquaintances on a social network that you tend to expose yourself to. So those relationships, again, in a Calonian sense, are prone to overflows. So they can lead to overflows, and that's inevitable, both psychological and social. Now, what is very perhaps unique about health pandemics is that, as opposed to other types of disasters, health pandemics can generate very, very integral and visceral emotions which are reactions to threats of harm, loss, change. And that's why, according to some studies, we see a prevalence of, for example, quack cures or folk remedies. In many cases, civil unrest, riots, mass panic. So health pandemics specifically have this ability to lead on to these exaggerated reactions. And what we argue is that the mainstream accounting and finance literature, and also to a certain extent, cognitive behavioral literature, probably ignores the nuance that you see in sociology to explain the social psychology of market agents. So you really need more modern interpretations of behavioral finance literature to understand what goes on. And we also argue that labeling these events as externalities and black swans are mere oversimplifications, and they do not help get to the bottom of what's going on. And finally, we show that these Calonian overflows are quite common to both bank runs and supermarket runs, and presumably to other types of panic runs. So thank you very much for listening to both of us, and we very much look forward to hearing your thoughts and views.
Thank you, Arman. Thank you, Gulnur. So we have a question in the chat, and I will be making everyone a panelist shortly. So if you could just answer these questions from Orkan. What is it then that you think is missing in the standard diamond and I can't pronounce that other name, diving,
Diving.
diving bank run model where agents are individualistically rational but run because of strategic interactions? So that was the first question.
Yeah.
Arman, do you want to start, or shall I start and you continue?
Yeah. So I referred to this in also when I was going through my part of the slides. From my perspective, the D&D model, let's say, is obviously a very well-known mainstream finance model, but it's grounded in economic rationality. And I think that's why it only goes so far. I think it does not use all the tools that it can use, which we argue could be some of the insights from sociology and behavioral finance. It does not talk about emotions. It characterizes what we see in this type of behavior as apparently irrational, and it uses the mere self-interest of agents as the main driver of the model, which we argue, in fact, that's the core of our paper. We argue that's not enough, and we need to do more. So that's my two pence. Gulnur, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, just like every other model, we have to evaluate in the context of the time.
Yeah.
Which is 1980s. And the model is very elegant because it's important in those times to come up with multiple Nash equilibria, and which is an advancement over a singular equilibrium. And what they account for is they come up with this multiple equilibria, and it's also very strong in terms of defining the financial market as one that works on the mismatch of the maturity of the assets and the liabilities. Obviously, one outcome is the collapse of the system in the case of a bank run. And really, the model itself doesn't have a rational explanation to it, other than saying in rational terms that if the agents expect every other agent to withdraw the money, but we don't know whether that's a rational expectation or not. Okay, so it's the same case in the supermarket runs. I mean, obviously, if every other agent expects every other agent to buy all the rice in the supermarket, then you want to run before them to run it for yourself. But is this rational? And in both cases, both the supermarket runs and the banking system, we know this is not rational because the system rests on this mismatch of maturities. So the whole system is based on that. You buy the rice today, tomorrow's rice will be available tomorrow. It's still in the fields today. You buy the potato today, tomorrow's potato is still in the field today. It will be available tomorrow. If you buy it today, you collapse the system. So I think it's not, I mean, to me, it's like, it's a very nice, neat model, but you have to consider it in the context that it is developed and the questions that were asked at that time and how it responds to that questions. And the two ways they respond is they articulate the mismatch in maturities, which we know now and, as kind of like common knowledge today, and the use of multiple equilibria, which was new at that time in financial economics and finance, that there is the possibility of more than one equilibrium. And one they themselves describe as irrational expectations. Why should everyone go and buy the food at the same time, with or without the need? Yeah. So I think, I would like to see it in that sort of perspective. And I can see that Orkun has another question, which goes, what is the empirical observation that the standard models cannot explain, but you can? Well, I don't think that we can explain a behavior fully because it's very complex. But what the standard models cannot explain is that we observe what is not narrowly defined as non-rational in those models. We certainly observe that. I mean, if people were rational the way economic theory predicts them, in a von Neumann-Morgenstern type of utility maximization type, rationality being perfect foresights, you're expecting the mean and the mean happens. It doesn't happen. I mean, it's, you know, we observe that it doesn't happen. So what we're trying to bring is another viewpoint where the agents in those models don't have to be those atomic agents that are rational. The unit of analysis can be the interaction itself rather than an atomic agent. So that's what we propose to understand what's going on, because we observe what's going on. So, I mean, it's just in plain sight, and we definitely observe that. But what we're proposing is that understanding that behavior is very difficult under the rational paradigm. So we need to use a paradigm that shifts the unit of analysis, basically.
Also, Gulnur, I think talking about rationality can be rather unhelpful because it has different meanings for different people according to different circumstances. So, for example, in the case of supermarket runs, for some individuals, it might have been completely rational for them to not go to the supermarkets because that would have exposed them to potentially contagion. And especially in those early days, I think social distancing was very lax. So masks were not mandatory in the UK, I think, in those early days. So so it was dangerous. So was it the rational thing to do, or would it not have been better to stay home and order through, order online from supermarkets? But then you could argue that for some people, perhaps it was the rational thing to do. So when you look at specific cases, I think what this actually translates to in terms of actions on the ground can be very opaque. And it's a binary model, unfortunately. Are you rational? Are you irrational? I don't think we can use binary models in these complex landscapes. We really need continuums.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Gulnur.
Hi, Richard.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Excellent presentation. I'd love to see the paper. I'd love to see the model, because it sounds brilliant. I think a good thing to do to answer maybe the previous question would be, I presume you've got parameters in there that are measuring a level of some kind of irrationality or behavioral, factors. Could you kind of come up with a benchmark model, which is the fully rational model, and show what happens there, and then add in these layers, and then is there a critical kind of level? So do all the agents in your model have the same levels of irrationality or behavioral biases or whatever? Is there a critical level at which switches to this supermarket run? Do you have mixtures where there's so many agents that have one level of rationality and so many agents that are at another level? And another question, just to add to that, I was really interested at the beginning when you said about the self-interest, because one of my areas I'm really interested in is social preference theory. So the idea of empathy, trust, fairness, that sort of thing. And what I thought you were going to possibly talk about was this idea that I read somewhere, or I heard someone saying that in good times, benign times, when there's lots of resources, we're all kind of very happy, then we do have empathy for each other, we care about each other, etc. So you could have, in benign times, we want everybody to have resources, we want to help each other. When times get tough, we revert to the kind of like caveman times, and we're kind of everyone against everyone. So you could have social preference in here as well, and the idea that when times are good, people care about each other, have some sort of empathy, and then when times get really bad, they're then self-interested, but with the fear added on, if you like.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I mean, I'll take this one first, Arman.
Yes, yes.
I think, I mean, we didn't develop a mathematical model, Richard. So, I mean, maybe a mathematical model can be developed, again, nice and neat, and looking at the social preferences and how they change under total uncertainty or under panic or under fear. And I think that would be a very good one. But we didn't have a mathematical modeling exercise in this paper. So it's merely a theoretical exercise, shifting the discussion from a perfectly rational world and shifting the unit of analysis and moving it towards the analysis of the agent and the network together. I mean, and not making the agent even atomic, but with bias. So it's kind of like no bias, normal people, and they work within the network, and that's the way they work. But I think it's valuable. So, maybe we can talk about this later. And how to develop a mathematical model. Maybe you can help us on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Richard. Similarly, I think both your points are very helpful. What you said about social preference theory, you're absolutely right. In the paper itself, I think we make some references to it, but that's not the core of our argument. And I have to go back and look at the literature on that. What you said about people acting in extreme ways in desperate times reminded me of some evolutionary arguments that, of course, we're all social animals, and there are animals, especially in the rodent family, that sometimes when you put them in extreme situations, for example, hunger, they do eat their newborns even. So there are evolutionary examples of very extreme behavior, which of course we would characterize as unethical or immoral. But you're right, and I think that's very interesting to see how this pans out in humans and where this takes us. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
I think we have Z and Jianmin Lu. Z Shaibu, I think you're first. Alicia, can you unmute Z?
Of course. I've asked Z to unmute. Z, if you have a question, please unmute your microphone and turn on your camera. And that goes for anyone. If anyone's got any more questions or queries, please unmute your microphones and turn on your cameras. Thank you.
Just out of interest, is there a sociologist in the audience today? Anyone from a sociological background? Okay.
Okay, then I'll go again then. It's interesting for me to think about this when you're talking about, people's preferences and the way they change during this crisis. So we know of family, friends, okay, I'm not going to name them, or who are denying this and saying this thing isn't existing. This thing is fake news. We go to the supermarkets, we don't wear our masks, it's a load of rubbish, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Is this some kind of behavior that we can think about where people are kind of almost denying it and going the other way?
I mean, what is it that they're denying? Are they denying that there is a virus, or are they denying that people are acting in a greedy manner?
No, they're denying there's a virus. These are people we know, okay? So we know some crazy people, but these are people who are saying this is, or not necessarily denying it, but saying it's not as bad as you think, it's fake news, we're not going to let it, get to us, we're going out without our masks on, and of course we're trying to argue with them, but they don't.
I think I don't want to answer that, because I'm not a medical professional. So I think it's not within my limits. I mean, the medical professionals, it's up to them to understand what the virus is, how dangerous it is, whether
But
it's
Gulnur, can I just quickly say, it's almost as if it's all to us. It's almost like bravado. They're almost kind of not wanting to believe it, but in a way they do. But they're kind of.
I think that's still beyond, beyond my frame. I mean, I'm not a clinical psychologist either. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, with various diseases that appear like, you say you're a prophet, but you're not. Well, it's, kind of like the common normal is there is no prophet. That's why you're not a prophet, isn't it? So I want to keep away from that discussion because, either medically or in terms of clinical psychology, I mean, there isn't much that I can contribute to that. But all I can observe is how people behave under that fear. Because, like myself, most people are not medical professionals. We know what we read in the papers, and we know, what we see on the television. And, this is a virus. And really, I don't know, for example, the probability of death for me, my age, my gender, my occupation, etc. I don't know it. Okay, so there is no calculation that's circulating around that I can say, so, this is my probability of death under normal circumstances. This is the probability of death. When I go to the supermarket only once in three months and stock for 3 months, or this is the probability of death if I go every week and continue with my weekly shopping. We don't know. I mean, it's kind of like total uncertainty. And, most people are, in some range of normal people. And I assume that most people are like myself. And we're kind of like, it's total uncertainty to me. I really don't know. And I think this is the case with most people. You don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I have a good background in statistics. I can't even roughly estimate from the numbers I see here and there, what is the probability of death for me? I mean, I don't even know it under normal circumstances either. I mean, I'm sure that colleagues working in actuarial science have some sort of life expectancy tables, and they would say, well, here is your probability. I don't even know that. To me, that's also total uncertainty. I really don't know. So I can't assign that sort of probability to myself. So to me, what's interesting is how people behave under those circumstances. And unnecessarily, I mean, we didn't touch upon that, but in almost every religion, there is this concept of greed, which is very sinful. So that is usually defined as kind of like eating more than you can, getting more than you can, you can process, etc. I mean, under normal circumstances, there is this sort of knowledge with everyone that almost every produce takes some time to get produced. I mean, this is known to everyone. And, even in old times, I mean, you knew that, I don't know, this vegetable comes in this season, so you pickle it for the other. I mean, so this is kind of like inherently known. And it's kind of like the same with bank runs as well. Well, everyone knows that this is the amount of cash in circulation, and there is a lot more virtual somewhere in the banking system. And no bank carries enormous amounts of money. So even in a normal transaction, I mean, if you wanted to go and withdraw, I don't know, 50,000 in cash from your bank branch, but they wouldn't be able to give it to you there and then. They would say, oh, come tomorrow, come in the afternoon, etc. So somehow we know it, but still we act that way. And in one definition of rationality, which is perfect foresight, if we had that sort of rationality, well, obviously we wouldn't have done it.
I was just thinking, it just came to me, Arman, in terms of this thing of our friends who are burying this in their mind. It's almost like the emotional finance framework. So they're kind of burying deep the risk of this and saying it's not an issue. Would that be a useful framework to think? Yeah, where people do not initially.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Richard. Obviously, why do conspiracy theories exist is a very interesting question, which is not related to our current paper, but I think it's really interesting. And from a behavioral psychological perspective, I think you can argue that when you're faced with radical uncertainty, the mind needs a story. And when there's so many unknowns, you need a simplifying meta-narrative actually to connect them together. And those could be in fact the conspiracy theories we see. So so I think that's really interesting. But those groups of people who believe that it's a sham or it doesn't exist probably do not feature among our cohort of interest, which is the people who do the supermarket runs anyway, because they will probably sit at home and then write blogs about it rather than actually
maybe go out to the supermarket 10 times a day, isn't it?
Yeah, so that's but I agree with you. I mean, it would be very interesting to start a paper about misperceptions or conspiracy theories in finance. I think that could be very interesting and try to understand them from a behavioral perspective. Yeah, but thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good
point. I guess we've slightly gone over time, Gulnur.
Yeah. We've gone over time, so shall we ask if there is a final comment or a final question?
Again, if you've got any more questions or queries, unmute your mic and turn on your camera.
Thank you very much.
Right. Okay. It was great talking to everyone, and thank you so much.